Good morning and welcome to our Built Environment Conference of 2025. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ian Richardson. I'm the Built Environment Sector Lead and responsible for the areas of competence and construction products. You may well have seen me on some of the other webinars that we've done in the past. We're going to just go through a few items before we begin with our presentations for today. We'll just have a quick look at the housekeeping, which again is probably something that you're very familiar with before from online events, but we'll run through it very quickly before the main part of the presentations. This is a listen-only online event, so your microphones and cameras will remain off. There is the question button at the top right of the screen for you to ask us any questions. We please encourage you to do that. There have been some pre-submitted, but please, as the presentations go through, feel free to drop any more questions in, which we will then add into the Q&A sessions later on. If you do experience any technical issues, report them through the same question box. We have a technical team in the background here that will do their best to support you if there are problems, and they will also monitor the chat box throughout the event. At the completion of the event, we do send out a feedback survey and we'll provide a link to the recording with that too. Again, we encourage you to give us your feedback. We can then put into future events that we do. And to learn more about those upcoming events, you can scan the QR code that's on screen at the moment, and that will appear again at the end when we talk about some future events that we have planned. So we'll go now into a quick run through of the agenda. It's a very busy 2.5 hours, so we've got quite a lot of speakers, lots of material to get through, which I'm sure will be really informative to everyone. We begin with the competence update, 2 presentations from Richard Harrell and John Vanston. Then we'll take a short break, coming back with Eurocodes after that, where my colleague Cara Ebanks will run through with Dr. Steve Denton, Professor David Nethercott. He pauses for the second slide. It's coming, I'm sure. There it is. Mungo Stacey, and then again my colleague Deirdre will talk through the development of standards and publication schedule. They will then have their own Q&A session with our closing at 12:15. So without further ado, we're going to go into the competence section first. This is, I think, an enormously timely topic to cover as part of our 2025 Built Environment Summit. I mean, it's somewhat incredible to me that I'm talking to you about our 2025 event when it feels like only yesterday we were having a 2024 event. I guess we're in December, January feels like yesterday. I presume that the answer to time flying by as it is that there is so much going on. These webinars, I think, are amazingly helpful. We do our best to give you as much information as we can on these topics, so that we support you in the challenges that these topics face. As you'll hear from both Richard Harrell, Technical Director at CABE, and John Vanston, Chairman of the Industry Competence Committee, there is an enormous amount happening on standards. There's an enormous amount happening within the industry, and an enormous amount happening on the regulatory side. So those are the topics we will try and cover as much as we can. I think because of the amount we've got to get through in the next 50 minutes, I won't dwell too much longer on this intro section. I think we're better off going straight into Richard. Richard, if you're there, I appreciate you joining us this morning. I will hand over to you and we will see you again at the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, and thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, BSI, for asking me to speak. Time has flown indeed, and I'm no longer technical director. I'm actually chief executive at CABE, but that's a minor detail. I'm going to take you through this morning an overview, a little bit of history, putting the role of CPB1 into context, and then an update on the work of the committee over time. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so if we go back in history, we know that the interim and final reports of the Independent Review of Building Regulations and Fire Safety flagged, amongst many, many other issues, the issue of competence within the industry overall. The key findings were that there were inadequate, unclear, and inconsistent assessment systems. the individual competence of a range of key individuals who'd been involved in the work at Grenfell Tower. The competence of those individuals was not necessarily clear or well managed. There was criticism of the competence of fire risk assessors working on complex and high-risk buildings because there was no statutory registration or accreditation requirement. There were questions about building control and in particular whether there was consistent management of competence across the various parts of the building control system. There was inconsistency in the requirements across safety critical trades, and there was a lack of regulation. And I think this is absolutely the case. And very topically, we're looking at a number of panels reporting on issues of competence for certain engineering and other professions, but the UK really does not control the competence of people undertaking tasks anywhere near as much as many other advanced economies. Next slide, please. So the final report recommended the development of a competence system, a national competence system for the environment. Everyone working on complex and high-risk buildings should have appropriate qualifications and experience and be able to evidence that. Work on those buildings would normally be expected to require a higher level of competence than work on simpler buildings. There was a recommendation for professional accreditation bodies to lead on the creation of a robust, comprehensive and coherent accreditation system for all disciplines, including complex and high-risk buildings. That would have to include measuring competence, making that competence outcome transparent to clients, and routes for redress. The system should close gaps in the current less rigorous and disjointed registration or certification arrangements. And overall, there was a recommendation to develop a joined up competence system that could be utilised through regulation to mandate suitably qualified or competent people undertaking critical work. Next slide, please. In parallel and subsequent to those recommendations, there was a lot of really good work led by Graham Watts at the CIC, but through the Industry Competence Steering Group, raising the bar, setting the bar, and a higher bar reports have all kind of followed in sequence. And it is really notable that the collaboration and coordination across pretty much sector groups representing the whole industry was pretty much unprecedented. There has been a huge industry movement to navigate into a more competence-led industry, and that is really to be welcomed. Next slide, please. Ultimately, the Raising the Bar report set out the first shape, if you like, the first image of what a system connecting regulators, residents, competent workforces, and the various other moving parts might look like. Next slide, please. To support that, BSI put in place a new committee, CPB1, which is the Competence in the Built Environment Committee. It has a very simple scope. It's responsible to the Standards, Policy and Strategy Committee for standardization needs for competence in the built environment. So it has a very broad remit, and that is reflected in the scope of work that it is currently undertaking, but is also likely to undertake over time. Next slide, please. It has a big committee representation. It has a very large number of representatives on the committee, which is entirely appropriate given that its remit spans all sectors in the built environment. It includes regulators, it includes professional bodies, trade bodies, accreditation and certification bodies. We're always open if there are parts of the built environment industries who feel that they aren't represented and want to get involved. We're always very open for people putting themselves forward. Next slide, please. So the first substantive piece of work that BSI undertook on competence in the built environment was the development of what was originally known as Flex 8670 and has now become BS 8670 Part 1, Competence Frameworks for Building Safety Core Criteria, a Code of Practice. Flex 8670 was developed using the Flex approach, which was effectively to have a series of very intensive consultations to rapidly prototype the standard over a period of about 12 months. Flex 8670 set out a new approach to trying to drive convergence in building safety approaches to competence and building safety competence frameworks. It adopted what we refer to as a benchmarking approach, in that the code of practice itself is intended to be applied by people who manage or develop competence frameworks to ensure that they have the right criteria within their framework to deliver safe outcomes. The criteria include behavioural, technical and professional competencies, and they're intended to ensure that whatever framework you have already is fit for purpose in the longer term. Next slide, please. Subsequent to 8670 being produced, government sponsored the development of three critical PASs, publicly available specifications. PAS 8671 is the framework for competence of individual principal designers. BS 8672 is the framework for competence of individual principal contractors. And PAS 8673 set out competence requirements for the management of safety in residential buildings. These three standards are obviously absolutely key in establishing criteria to support the duty holding regime introduced through the Building Safety Act and Section 2A of the building regulations. And these standards are going to be subject to review in the next calendar year. Next slide, please. In terms of standards that have been developed and are in development, CPB1 continues to support work to develop key national level standards, relying on the contribution of experts from across the built environment. If you're watching this webinar and you believe you can contribute, I think being involved in the standards development committees is a very rewarding and very enhancing experience. So I would encourage people to get involved if they have that opportunity. The first framework that's come out after the PASs is BS 8674, which is a framework for competence of individual fire risk assessors, code of practice. That's now been published. It's been very successful in terms of uptake, and critically, it arrives at a time where the government is looking at how it will take forward recommendations for licensing of fire risk assessors. So it's an extremely important document nationally. We continue to look at how we can utilize the BS 8670 series of benchmarking standards to set convergence standards and drive improvements in competence for cross-cutting themes. So currently, there is BS 8670 Part 2, which is core criteria for construction product competence, code of practice, which is due to go out for public comment shortly. Absolutely critical area of competence that needs to be addressed. The role of product specification, selection, marketing, and manufacturing fundamental to safe outcomes in the built environment. And there has recently been the principal case for a new BS 8670 Part 3 standard provisionally, which is a core criteria for sustainability competence. A really tremendous piece of industry-led work by CIC and the Edge to develop an initial consensus standard on competence for sustainability, and that work will be being taken forward in the new year. Next slide, please. Early on in CPB1's work, I wanted to kind of talk about the ambition that the committee had. Prior to the development of the standards I've just been talking about, and over a period of 18 months or so, a small group looked at how the committee could maximise its support and benefit and maximise the public interest impact that its work could deliver. And the reason behind that was very much that this is not just a standard that is new or a new committee. It's very much that the competence based approach required in law and driven by government policy is very much a new area for industry to be working in as a whole. So we took a view that we should be open-minded about other actions we could take outside of a normal committee business, if you like, or scope to help maximize impact. The first piece of, I'm just going to mention a few of the actions that came out of this, but the first was to actually ensure that the scope of the committee was right. So there was a process of ensuring we had the right breadth, and that resulted in the simplification of the scope. We commissioned a small group to look at how the committee's work might map over or integrate greater links into academia and training organisations. So within the committee itself, we have a great number of organisations represented, but ironically, academic and training organisations were not well represented. So we now have an engagement strategy to ensure stronger links across to academia and training. One of the proposals within the action plan was to utilise the BSI committee as a convener to help provide thought leadership, to actually stimulate conversations around competence. And an output from that part of the report was the development of the BSI Competence Hub, which you'll be seeing later. And finally, a really critical piece of work undertaken by two of the committee members, Julie Hunter and Jill Koenig, on residents' engagement. So the standards making process is very thorough, it's very open, but there is a recognition that there are some groups who find it harder to leverage their life experience to influence the way that standards are then codified. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to kind of talk about this as the last part of my presentation, because this is about the work of CPB1 reading over in a fairly profound way into perhaps the next steps of evolution of standards making as a whole. So the report that was produced for CPB1 made 5 kind of key recommendations. Firstly, the mechanisms for proactive and meaningful engagement with consumers and residents to encourage participation in standards should be undertaken. Secondly, the barriers to participation should be properly understood. That requires research and then meaningful actions to address those barriers. It recommended that we should look at innovating in the way we deliver standards, so exploring different methodologies for incorporating resident interests and views. And the 2 methods proposed are evidence-based personas and citizens' assemblies. It recommended that the process of integrating approaches to increase residents' engagement needed to be driven through strong and robust governance measures so that these are fully integrated. And finally, there's a recommendation to create an inclusive culture within BSI so that this becomes a normal and valued part of day-to-day working. These recommendations have now been discussed with CB0, the strategic committee with oversight for the built environment standards, and the decision that's been made is that the evaluation of how we integrate this work should be taken forward at a more strategic level across BSI more widely. So really interesting, really valuable piece of work undertaken within the committee, and one that we think will help to improve competence standards and standardization development more widely in a really useful and meaningful way. So that brings me to the end of my session. Next slide, please. I'll be here for the Q&A at the end, but otherwise it's all that is there for me to do is So thank you, and hand over to John Vanston, who is the chair of the Industry Competence Committee.
All right, thank you, Richard. That was great, and good morning, everyone. I think it's great to be with BSI and all of you on the call who understand that standards are not just documents or committees or procedures. Standards are promises about the quality of our work, the safety of our buildings, and the competence of the people who shape our built environment. And today, as chair of the Industry Competence Committee, I want to take you through what we've been doing in 2025, how the system is changing, and what we believe must happen next year if the UK is going to deliver a truly competent built environment. Before I do that, I want to start with something a bit simple. We cannot deliver safety without competence, and we cannot deliver competence without coherence. And therefore, when we cannot deliver coherence without clear expectations. And that's the thread that has been running through the work of the ICC this year. We have focused on setting expectations and bringing clarity to industry. And in July 2025, ICC published the first stage of its expectations for industry. It wasn't guidance, it wasn't a framework, it was something much more fundamental. We put out for consultation the overarching principles for industry and our principles for individual competence. Because after years of reform, there was still no shared language across the system. People talked about competence, but differently. People talked about culture, but inconsistently. And at events we often attend, we are regularly asked, if competence is so important, what exactly do you expect of us? And so we wanted to help answer those questions. We gave the system a baseline, a common foundation, and a set of principles that everything else could rest upon. We asked three simple questions. Are the principles pitched at the right level? Will they help raise competence? And are they understandable? And the answer was a confident yes, but with a challenge from industry back to us. Keep it clear, keep it proportionate, and keep it focused on real behaviour and not just paperwork. And those principles have therefore become the backbone of everything that has since followed. In September, we published our second consultation, which is setting expectations for competence management. This time we moved from foundations to structure. We set out 15 expectations covering leadership, competence management systems, supervision, supply chain oversight, organisational capability, and simple accountability aligned to UK law. We held a workshop, we engaged at webinars, and we published on the HSE consultation portal as opposed to LinkedIn where we put our first one. We listened to people from every corner of the sector, from micro businesses to tier 1 contractors. And the message we received was clear. Industry wants clarity, not complexity. Industry wants support, not suffocation. And industry needs expectations that drive competence and not administrative burden. We will publish the final version early in 2026, aimed at being sharper, clearer, and more focused on competence outcomes than ever before. And I want to be clear that these expectations are not optional. They are what government expects, they are what the BSR expects, and they will shape how the entire system and sector demonstrates competence. I want to say a few words now about an area of the system which is under greatest pressure, building control. In 2025, our building control competence working group, which is overseen by ICC, has been a focal point of a lot of work this year. We've seen registration numbers in RBIs rising slowly, but capacity is still stretched. There has been some confusion between competence development supervision and delivery supervision, which we are clearing up. There's been inconsistent understanding of competency requirements across public and private sectors, and there has been an impact of the multidisciplinary teams on overall delivery. There's a real risk that the system is yet to have enough competent people to deliver at the standard the law now demands. We therefore have looked at how building control officers are used. We looked at what they're expected to do. We looked at the points where competence breaks down, and not because people don't care, but because the system around them isn't fully aligned. And because of this, we are producing clearer guidance on supervision. We're advising government on areas where legislative clarity may be needed. We're mapping the future workforce pipeline, and we're challenging assumptions about sufficient capacity, because too often the numbers look better on paper than they do on the ground. In 2026, we'll continue this work with greater urgency, because building control is not just a gateway process. It is the backbone of building safety. If we get building control competence right, the whole system strengthens. If we get it wrong, the whole system feels the strain. Another major milestone that's going to be talked about here is the development of the Competence Hub, driven by BSI and our own ICSG subcommittee. As will be evidenced later, this is the starting point of something big. The key points from ICC as regards to the hubs will be providing a single national landing point for competence framework. It will make it easier for SMEs and individuals to find what applies to them, and it will improve transparency. This will help bring order to a space that has historically been scattered and difficult to navigate. I know it's an MVP launch, but let's not underestimate what it represents, particularly for us at ICC, because for the first time, industry competence will have a proper home. Our ICSG subcommittee, though, has done a lot more than just work on the hub. It has focused on how to improve how sector groups present and structure the frameworks that drive competence. They're using outcome-based templates, they're providing data up to ICC, they're aligning the frameworks with our own ICC statutory duties and demands, and they're reducing duplication across sectors. ICSG has become an important point of unity where people and organisations willingly collaborate to develop frameworks that support the different functions of our industry. And in 2026, ICC will begin monitoring whether these frameworks are actually being used and not just written, how they're being embedded, and the adoption cycles we're seeing. Having a framework is one thing, embedding it is another. So when I look back at 2025, 3 lessons jump out to me, and I think they're lessons that the system cannot afford to ignore. Lesson 1, competence hasn't caught up with expectations. We still see gaps in supervision in areas. We still see gaps in change control, and we see gaps in supply chain oversight. Competence cannot be assumed, it must always be demonstrated. Second lesson I'd say is clients remain a weak point to us. We've seen competent teams undermined by poor client decisions. So in 2026, this year, for publication in 2026, ICC established its new Client Competence Working Group. That's under our Setting Expectations program. Because if clients don't understand competence, they cannot appoint competent people. And the final lesson I'd raise is competence is not a checklist. It is behavior, it is a judgment, and it is culture. A competent system isn't one where everyone has a certificate. It's one where people do the right thing even when no one is watching. And as I look forward to 2026, this will be the year where ICC moves from building the system to testing the system. We're working on coherence across government and the regulator, as different parts of government must speak the same language. Regulatory expectations must align, and industry must not be given contradictory signals. ICC is there to help deliver that coherence. We're looking also to embedding outcome-based competence. We will shift the emphasis from qualifications and certifications to performance, from training to behavior, and from paperwork to evidence. Competence must be seen and not simply claimed. We see building control as a national priority. We will therefore deepen our work on supervision, workforce planning, legal clarity, and competency assessment, because a regulatory regime is only as strong as the people delivering it. As regards competence in the golden thread, we will clarify what good quality information looks like, because a competent system produces competent information. And a key point of our update session this morning is, and we will be looking at turning the Competence Hub into a national asset. By the end of 2026, the hub we will be promoting as the default reference point, trusted, accessible, and comprehensive. ICC will be pushing for that outcome at every step of the way, and supporting both BSI and ICSG in delivering that. I would like to finish with a thought though, because when we talk about competence, we are really talking about trust. Trust that the people designing our buildings know what they're doing. Trust that those constructing them understand the risks. Trust that those overseeing them are confident, capable, and supported. And trust that when families go to sleep at night, the building around them is safe by intention and not by luck. That trust was broken. Our job is to rebuild it, and competence is a way for us to rebuild it. 2025 has very much been finishing touches on the foundation. 2026 must be a year of both consolidation and accountability. And with all of your help, with your expertise, with your challenge, ICC will continue driving the system towards something coherent, competent, and worthy of the public's confidence. Thank you. I believe I am doing a hand. Yes, I'm now handing over to Ian in the competence section.
Yes, this is correct. Thank you so much, John, and thank you so much, Richard. While my colleagues in the background give me the ability to share my screen, so if I speak very slowly while I do that, here we go. This is looking good. I shall just give you a little bit of insight into the Built Environment Competence Hub. So John has mentioned this. He used the words MVP. This is definitely where we're at. If we're honest, this is our attempt to build something that we think will be exactly what both Richard and John described, a real asset to the sector on competence. You can see from the language that we use on the landing page at the moment, it's developed in collaboration with the Industry Competence Steering Group. It is meant to bring you all together to engage on competence and share what you think best practice is, as well as finding all of those key resources and standards and the competence frameworks that you are going to need in one place. So we've built this, what we describe as a community. You can see the URL at the top there, competence.bsigroup.com. That should go into the chat function for you to see. Pre-registration for the hub is now open. That will give you early access at the beginning of January to go into the hub and start looking around and register and use it. So please do so for our 2026 launch and sign up for that early access. You can see here the sign up button that will do that. This is going to be a critical space for everybody to use, and a trusted knowledge and resource hub, making it easier for you to find the things that matter to you. So that's the landing page where you can sign up. If I go over to what it looks like once you've logged in, hopefully you can see that. I'll just double check. Yes, I think you can hopefully see me logged in. So when I go into this is what the home page will look like. This is basically where all the themes will be. Currently it's split out across all the main themes across the built environment. You will see that there are some discussions and resources that are, as I say, this is the early stage of the build of the Built Environment Competence Hub, and so this will grow more before January. But what we hope is that the more activity happens within the competence area, and all of those standards and competence frameworks that Richard mentioned, they will all go up on here. What we hope is that you will use the discussion section too, and the calendar section, to start to signpost to your colleagues through the hub exactly what your challenges are. John described that move towards a truly competent built environment, and we genuinely believe that the investment that's been made in the hub and the hundreds of people that have already signed up for pre-registration will mean it will grow exponentially in 2026. So that's basically all I'm able to share at the moment. because we just don't have time to go into any more detail than that. But of course, we will have a launch event for the hub for those that have signed up for it towards the back end of January, where we will explain a lot more, and there will be guidance and materials that will be provided to help you navigate through use and utilization of the hub. So we're going to go into a short Q&A session. We've got 14 minutes left in the competence section before we hand over to Eurocodes. So if John and Richard, if you could join me momentarily, I will ask you some wonderful spontaneous questions. There's been a few added in today, as well as those that I saw previously. I don't know if either of you, I mean, you've both mentioned the hub in your presentations, and thank you for that. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add at this point on the hub, or we can go into some of the questions that we've been asked. If not, if you're happy with it, then we will.
I think from my perspective, Ian, as I probably unfortunately stole a bit of your thunder by going into it, I'm quite excited about it. As in, I think for industry for a long time hasn't known exactly where to go. I think this is a great thing that BSI has done, and it's very much appreciated, and it will create a very clear link between what we put out as a statutory committee, which will have a new home itself in early 2026, connecting directly to the practicalities of what that means, and I think that it will be a wonderful resource.
Yes, and one of the questions that literally popped up as you were speaking, John, was who is the hub for? And in my, I mean, I'm not perhaps, quite, we talk about the support that we've had from ICSG, ICC, and the building safety regulator. If we acknowledge that too, I would in a very sort of simplistic way say it's for everybody. When you talked about the expectations for industry, and Richard, you talked about this within the work that CPB1 is doing. I mean, I presume that is true, that we would say across the built environment sector, there is nobody we would say the hub isn't for. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the simple aspirations for what we need to do with industry, it's that everyone's working within an environment where competence is managed. So it is applicable and relevant to everyone, and organizations as well as individuals over time. What I would say is that, I mentioned the work initially done by the CSG, and then that's flowed across into the ICC and the ICSG. I know from the work I've done with yourself and your colleagues that BSI is there to support the industry to get better in terms of competence and to support it. So I would really encourage people to sign up and then get involved, and if they have ideas about how the hub can help to drive competence and build confidence in being competent, get engaged. And the more that the industry invests in the hub, the better the hub will be, and the better the outcomes will be for us all across the industry as well.
Brilliant. And it feels a bit like we're dominating this conversation about the hub, but I think that just demonstrates the level of importance that everybody's placed on. In fact, Sean is putting some questions in there about, will the hub incorporate the occupation SCEB documents from sector-led group 10? I presume it will, because you talked, John, about how ICSG itself hopes to utilize the hub and place all competence frameworks, or certainly links to them, on the hub. I presume when we're talking about those type of SCEB documents, that they would find their way on the hub as well. I don't know if you're able to answer that one particularly, or we can just assume again that I'm saying the truth.
No, you're right. Put simply, yes, as in that is the home for the outputs of the sector-led groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sean, it's not. I wouldn't. You've asked if it's open source. I wouldn't describe it as that so much, but I would say that it does give you the opportunity to upload information yourself that you think is pertinent. This is why I think the themes are important. So let's take something related to design. If you felt like that particular theme, you needed some information or something to find its way onto that section, then you're able to upload that type of information yourself. So I think it is supposed to be interactive amongst the community, rather than just something that's closed off. Just to try and expand on some of the questions then that we've been asked, because I do think that digs into some of the points you've made. So, for example, there were some points made around smaller organisations, and one of the questions, John, that was asked was about about SMEs, I believe, that you mentioned. How can smaller organisations, and someone asked, how do we assess the competence of consultants to be classed as designers? Do you want to just elaborate on that particular bit?
Sorry, Ian, you were breaking up a bit there on your mic. So
my apologies. My apologies. Yeah, it's probably a bandwidth point on my side. So, is it better now? Can you still hear me, or is it still struggling?
now. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll tell my wife to get off Netflix or something like that. Perhaps that might be better. So yeah, I think when we're talking about competence of smaller sort of involvement of smaller organisations or specialist contractors and their competence. Someone asked in the questions about how do we assess the competence of consultancy? Do we classify them as designers? Is there something you can elaborate on that side, perhaps?
I think I heard you. Sorry. As regards SMEs and specialists, I think that there's a point that I think I made when I was talking about we're trying to make it that the evidence is without heavy admin, and so we're trying to use simple risk-based one-page records, treat supervision as a core competence record, and reference recognized frameworks in creating new ones, leverage the hub, and keep evidence credible but proportionate. I think you said something about designers, was it, and consultants, and
Yes.
Was that how we see them? Was it or?
It was. How do we assess the competence of consultants? It was directly the question.
Yes. Well, the problem with consultants is it's a very broad area. So I think we'd probably need to break down exactly where they're working, how that applies, because I'm a consultant myself. So what do I do, and how do you assess my competence? It's the relevance to the tasks that you're undertaking. I would say, though, with some of the moves we're making, so if you take competence, the evolution of it, we're moving very much away from that static, I have a qualification, to more dynamic judgment, behavior, risk awareness. So we'll be, I think, when it comes to consultants, and we'll be increasing the emphasis on decision making under uncertainty, understanding legal duties and limits, abilities to challenge, escalate concerns, and organizational capability, because they're often in structures, not just individual skills. So I think with any element that we're dealing with, we're focusing more on the outcome based, not certificate based. You know, obviously I have some certificates, but some might say they're pretty irrelevant to what I then talk about. And it's where do I interact in the market? What do I do? What is the evidence to say that I'm competent to do that? And how do I prove it? Because accountability in law is about pushing that definition towards real performance, not just paperwork. So I think I get the point that consultants are a very broad area. But it might be a case of we actually need to put something out there about that. Don't know if Richard has any thoughts in that area, but I think it will depend where exactly they land, because we've got consultants in all aspects of it.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, go on, Richard, because you might not be able to hear me very well. So yeah, you jump in. Thank you.
I was going to say that I think the first point is for people to get more familiar with differentiating between qualifications and competence-based systems. So understanding what kinds of approaches actually span the skills, knowledge, experience, and behavioural spectrum and are able to evidence it. And that's the big challenge for organisations and industry as a whole, to move away from singular sources of evidence or evidence that's focused on knowledge but not application, to these more comprehensive systems that have multiple touch points to check that someone is going to deliver the right outcomes, rather than just demonstrate kind of more kind of specific criteria. So I think kind of being familiar with what a competence-based system is and a competence-based piece of evidence is going to be important for people who are going to be under time pressure to do those checks within the supply chain or within project teams. And so kind of investing in understanding the different approaches and schemes and processes that are available is going to be a kind of precursor to being able to deliver that on the job. I think it's the kind of thing that discussions on the Competence Hub will be able to kind of drive a shared understanding of these kind of approaches. And you know, that it is about having a shared understanding ultimately of what good practice looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah, come on, John.
I was just going to add, and this is the thing with anything like the hub and anything like the consultations we do, it's a two-way communication, as in we it's very easy to sit in certain areas and think, well, this is what industry needs to know, obviously. And then when you go to an event, you find out that's not actually the questions they're asking. And I think this is where the hub will help drive that, because we will reflect upon what is coming back and what actually is needed in industry. It's why we've taken on the client work we're now doing, because we've had too much from, it's all very well you're telling industry, this is us as an individual, this is us as an organization. Client don't understand it. And we need something that we can point to. So hence that. And I think a lot of the activity we'll do will be led by what industry needs.
Sorry, you button. Yeah, absolutely. And I think a demonstration of that is that we can sort of second guess what we think the type of information we put up on the hub, what will be useful. But I think you're absolutely right. The bit that's going to be most critical is then how people tell us what the challenges are and tell us where the areas of perhaps confusion or misunderstanding are, and then that will allow us to react to it. So I do think there is just as much of a two-way communication through the hub as us placing things on there, go and have a look at this. It's also, where are you experiencing difficulties, what is causing you problems, and that could be small organizations, as we already said, or tier one. So I think let's also, I wonder if this leads us into, somebody did ask, how can competencies be enforced? And I think enforced is a very interesting word to use, but of course the building safety regulator might need to be referenced here. But how would you both feel about the sort of back end of all of this, that once we sort of get through the SCEB side of it, what's the enforcement aspect here, or even assessment?
I'd say the system's set up so for enforcement to be kind of retrospective in outside of HRB. So within high risk buildings, the gateway process does allow for the regulator to challenge the competence of the teams that work there. Mandatory occurrence reporting can flag where there's competence issues within teams. I think that as the BSR or the single regulators experience grows in regulating HRBs, that they will move into looking at those criteria as risk prevention criteria more actively as part of that process. Within the rest of the system, the onus has to be on the clients and principal designers, principal contractors, but also any consultants who are actually appointing or involved in the appointment of the supply chain. They're going to have to take the onus on of self-policing the way that they bring people into those projects. Same with contractors. They're going to have to look at how they can evidence the way that they've checked the competence of the supply chain that they're pulling together. That enforcement, I suspect, will become, that self-policing, if you like, will become far more rigorous as case law develops. There will eventually be, I'm sure, prosecutions in relation to people not being able to evidence competence where things go wrong. That will take time to come forward. I think breach of contract case law is likely to drive behaviour kind of at an earlier point, where clients are actually able to demand that the supply chain evidences how it managed its competence where outcomes have not been acceptable. So it is really, really important that everyone involved in operation management, construction, design understands that they have to be able to evidence the way that they've managed the competence of the people they work with and for through that process, because if things go wrong, that evidence will be needed. And it's not a matter of waiting for someone to say, are you collecting that evidence, or prove it. You just need to be doing it. And that law has been in effect now for years. So you know, it's a reality. It might not be tangible, but it's there. And
yes,
you know, there's a lot of goodwill and there's a lot of work going on to help support people do this. But it's really important people actually make that
John,
step up.
do you have a final thought on that? Because we're going to have to close shortly.
And thanks for Richard going first on that one. I think there's 4 practical ways, effectively, as in you've got the legal duties. The Building Safety Act requires key roles to be competent. Regulators can refuse approvals, issue compliance notices, or prosecute where competence is not demonstrated. You have licensing and registration. Certain roles, say building control inspectors, must prove competence before they're allowed to operate. This model can be extended to other safety critical roles. You then have the contracts and procurement, as Richard said. Clients can enforce competency by acquiring evidence for awarding work. If you cannot prove competence, you don't get the job. This is probably often the strongest day to day. And finally, probably organizational systems and accountabilities, because companies must have proper supervision, training, competence management. If they fail, directors can be held personally liable.
Yeah, absolutely. This is it. I think we have all the standards for individual competence and the job titles within them at the moment, and the feeling is that standards will move towards organizational competence. So I think Richard probably alluded to that within his presentation. But we've run out of time, so thank you so much to the both of you for giving up the time this morning to give what was an amazing 50 minutes of presentations and Q&A. So thank you so much. As we say, we've got a comfort break now. We'll be back at 5 to 11, where I will hand over to my colleague Cara and the Eurocode session. We'll see you shortly. Thank you.
Okay, hope everyone's back and ready. So welcome back. Thank you to Ian, Richard and John for their earlier presentations. Really, really interesting. So we're now going to spend an hour or so chatting about Eurocodes. And this is what we hope to be the first of a few presentations on this subject. over the next couple of years as we transition from generation 1 to generation 2, and of course the approach of the date of withdrawal in March 2028. So I'm delighted to introduce 5 presenters today, all of whom are experts in and very integral into the development of your European Eurocodes and national supporting standards and documents as well. So first we'll hear from Steve Denton, European Committee CEN/TC 250 Structural Eurocodes Chair and Managing Director at WSP. Next we'll have Professor David Nethercott, National Committee Chair of B525 Building and Civil Engineering Structures. Mungo Stacey, who's the National Committee Chair of B5251 Actions and Basis of Design. And as of January 2026, will be Chair of CEN/TC 250 SC1 Eurocode 1 Actions on Structures and Head of Profession at WSP. Chris Hendy follows him, the National Committee Chair on B52510 Bridges and Head of Bridge Engineering at Atkins Realis. And last is Deirdre Fury, who's with BSI and the Lead Standards Development Manager for the National Implementation of Eurocodes. So I'll hand over to Steve now, who will take us through the first presentation.
Cara, thank you very much. Can I just check you can hear me okay? Excellent, thank you, thank you. Well, if we move on to the next slide, thank you very much for that introduction, Cara. And just say my name is Steve Denton. I'm Managing Director of the Civil Unit at WSP, Vice President of the Royal Academy of Engineering, but most pertinent for today, for the last 12 years, I've been the chair of CEN/TC 250, which is the committee with overall responsibility for the Eurocodes, and it's been my privilege to lead the development of the second generation of these really key standards. And for those of you less familiar with the territory, the Eurocodes are the design standards for the construction sector across Europe. They cover buildings and civil engineering works, including geotechnical engineering. So they have an exceptionally wide footprint. They're really important standards, and a pleasure to be talking to you about them today. And my brief is to give you something of an introduction and overview of what we've been doing at a European level over the last decade or so to develop the second generation of these crucial standards. So the first generation of these standards was published between 2002 and 2007. In the UK, the conflicting standards were withdrawn in 2010, and then they came into mainstream use from then. And we've been working, as I said, for the last decade or so to develop the second generation of these standards. And we'll talk later on between us around implementation timescales. But I'm just going to give you a little bit of background and talk about the objectives for the work, a bit on timeline and approach, and then also talk to you about where you could find some further information beyond what you'll hear today. So let me kick off with the background and objectives. So if we move to the next slide. So as I've said, the Eurocodes are the design standards for buildings and civil engineering works across Europe. The second generation standards are mapped out on the left-hand side of the screen. A broad interdependent suite of around 64 standards supported by some technical specifications and technical reports that span from the basis of design, actions on structures, through to multiple material parts, geotechnical design and seismic design. And on the right-hand side of the screen is the committee structure responsible for the Eurocodes. And it's a very extensive committee structure. Here you can see the sort of top tier of that committee structure, but it actually stretches out to over 120 subcommittees, working groups, task groups. So it's been a huge effort over the last decade across many people to work on the development of these standards. And if we move to the next slide, one of the important things to understand around the role of the Eurocodes is that they sit as part of and a key part of the wider family of standards for the construction sector, European standards for the construction sector. And so one of the things that we've worked very hard on over the period of the evolution of the Eurocodes is to make sure that there is really strong alignment and actually to improve the alignment and consistency between the Eurocodes as design standards and the companion European product standards and European execution standards. And another key point, and David will talk about this a little later, and I'm sure the other presenters will as well, that part of the way in which the Eurocodes operate is that they have key national annexes that support them. So there are certain matters that are reserved for national determination under European law, and those matters are identified within the Eurocodes, and they are then left open for national choice, particularly around issues to do with safety. So all safety factors in the Eurocodes are what we term nationally determined parameters, and their values are given in national annexes, which means that the national annexes that accompany the Eurocode suite have a particular importance. I mean, they're obviously important for all standards, but they have a particular importance and some differences from other standards within the Eurocode suite. And then if we move on to the next slide, and I've already started to talk a little bit around timelines, but there is a long history here. So the original development of the Eurocodes started 50 years ago. As I said, the first EN standards were published between 2002 2007, implementation from 2010, and then as you can see in this broad timeline, since then we have been working on the development of the second generation Eurocodes, and particularly over the last decade or so. And crucially, we've been working really tenaciously to hit a crucial deadline, because in order to enable countries to prepare for the transition, we committed to having all of the standards, the second generation standards, available by March 2026, in order to give a 2-year transition period before the date of withdrawal of the first generation documents, or the date of withdrawal which is specified in the standard, which applies to the first generation Eurocodes, which is March 2028. And so in order to achieve that March 2026 availability, we needed to conclude all of the formal votes on the new second generation documents by the end of November. And I'm immensely proud that collectively, as DC250, we've been able to hit that deadline. So we're absolutely on track for this timeline. If we then just move to the next slide, I thought it might be of interest to you just to share a little bit around the high-level objectives that we set ourselves as DC250. You know, obviously a real commitment to hit that timeline, but also some real priorities about enhancing ease of use and achieving exemplary levels of consensus across Europe, across the 34 CEN members that all have participated in this work. And then if you move to the next slide, in terms of enhancing ease of use, and I'll spin through this very quickly, but what I wanted to highlight was that this was a real focus. And again, if we move to the next slide, you know, from the outset of my chairmanship, one of the first things that we did was to really explore and seek to understand and build consensus around what ease of use meant to us and what we were seeking to achieve on this front. And we thought about it not just in terms of the principles, but in terms of how we operationalized that within the work of TC250. If we move to the next slide, we did that by developing a model, 5 pillars of areas that we focused on. And again, if we move to the next slide, you know, a crucial step in this was being very, very clear when you have thousands of people working on a project together. It's very, very important that we had clarity on the intended audience. So we agreed and defined and reached consensus on the definition of our primary target audience. Again, you can see on the screen, competent civil, structural and geotechnical engineers, typically qualified professionals able to work independently in relevant fields. So that we could make sure that that was in the minds of everyone who was authoring and reviewing the standards. But what we also recognized was that there are many other audiences, many other different groups of users. Again, if we move to the next slide, we then thought deeply about what our statements of intent, what our aims were to support all of the different Eurocode user categories. So for our core audience, those competent engineers, we set out that clear aim to produce standards that are suitable and clear for all common design cases without demanding disproportionate levels of effort to apply them. But you can see on the screen, and if we move to the next slide, that for all of the other categories of users that we explored, we set ourselves clear aims for what we were trying to achieve, and those have served as a really important navigation tool, reference point, when we've had to make decisions around the nature of the drafting, how we focused, how we've tested ourselves to see whether we're fulfilling our aims in relation to ease of use. And then if we move on to the next slide, there's a host of things that we've done to try and support this endeavor around ease of use, but a lot of guidance materials, supporting materials, because again, people familiar with the Eurocodes will understand that drafting these documents is very challenging. They're very technically complex. Naturally, when you're working on a standard, at a point in time, you tend to be focused on particular clauses or particular sections of a standard. But for the users of the standard, we use them as a suite. And that means that consistency, interdependency, ease of navigation, clarity are all absolutely vital attributes of the standard. So we've developed a host of guidance materials, a huge amount of review activity to try and improve that consistency, clarity, navigation challenges that you can have in large suites of standards. And then if we just move on to the next slide, mentioned that the second aim that we had at the outset was about achieving exemplary levels of consensus. And again, we thought deeply about what this meant and how we could really embed the pathway to achieving exemplary levels of consensus across the work of TC250. Again, if you move to the next slide, again, this point around consensus, for those of you engaged in standardization activities will recognize that this is a core objective, absolutely core fundamental objective in terms of standards development. And we move to the next slide. The really exciting news from my point of view is that, as I mentioned, we concluded the formal voting just last week. And again, if we move to the next slide, those final formal votes meant that we now know the outcome in that level of consensus achieved, and I think everyone involved feels exceptionally proud that in the end, fewer than 0.3% of the votes available to be cast at formal vote stage were cast negatively. That corresponds to there being over 2,000 available votes to the NSBs on all of the documents that we released, and only 7 were cast negatively. And I think that's a real point of pride for us, because even some of those that were cast negatively were, for example, some disquiet about a particular annex or some particular individual clauses. So they weren't sort of whole-scale objections, and we're working to address those concerns through early amendments in any case. So then let's move on, because I know we're quite short of time, but if we just move on, I then just wanted to talk briefly around the timeline and approach. So I will fly through the next few slides, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of the scale and the programmatic approach we've taken for this work. Again, if we move to the next slide, a principal stimulus for the work that we've done has been the mandate from the European Commission. Mandate was the terminology that was used back at the time, 2013, 14. These days we would call it a standardization request, but what it does is it sets out the strategic direction that was being sought from the Commission, and crucially also unlocks availability of funding. And we then responded to that with a clear program for our plan to evolve the Eurocodes. And this was back in 2014, that was accepted by the Commission. And again, if we move to the next slide, that gave us a top-down perspective on the direction that we wanted to head in, but we also had systematic reviews through which all countries had the opportunity on a clause-by-clause basis to provide their feedback on the first generation of standards, and also their broader perspectives on some of the strategic aims that we'd set for the Eurocodes evolution. We collected thousands of comments, all of them catalogued, responded to, and fed into the evolution program that then has led to the development of the documents that have now concluded their formal voting stage. Okay, if we move through the next slide, again, a complex program that I'm not going to dwell on in too much detail, but an awful lot of different teams established, a very tightly managed program for how we organize the work. Again, if we move to the next slide, Key changes across the Eurocode suite has been the extension to cover structural glass, fiber polymer composites, and tension membrane structures, real focus around robustness, a key change in covering the existing structures, key requirement in civil and structural engineering these days, recognizing that so many of the assets that we will have in the future exist today, and the ability for us to assess them for change of use and also to affirm their adequacy and achieve their life extension is a really fundamental and core part of the work that we do these days. So the Eurocode scope has been extended to cover in part that area, also tackling climate change, that focus on ease of use, all things that we've spent a lot of time building into the Eurocode suite, the second generation Eurocode suite. Again, if you just move to the next slide, you can imagine this has been a highly complex program. Delivering it exactly on time to budget with the Commission has been quite a challenge, and we've put in an awful lot of measures to help us drive that through, and it's very gratifying that we've been able to deliver it exactly on program. And again, if we just jump to the next slide. Just a few quick headlines. So I mentioned the number of active subcommittees and working groups already. It's a huge family. The close ties with other technical committees and liaison and partner organizations, very, very strong. Many opportunities for people to comment on the standards as they've been developed. So we've followed all the usual SEN processes, but we've augmented those with additional opportunities for comments and feedback. All deliverables for the mandated work accepted by the Commission with no queries, and as I've already outlined, the level of consensus that we've achieved through formal vote. And and I think it's noteworthy that when we think around the scale of this program, that at a European level, there's probably been around 1,500 experts engaged across Europe, counting all the mirror committees. We can probably multiply that by a factor of about 10. So, a huge program of work, some way over 10,000 experts involved in it. And that's relevant because when the Commission did an impact assessment of the first generation of Eurocodes, they foresaw that the Eurocodes would be used by about 500,000 engineers across Europe alone. And so you can understand why so many people have been engaged in their evolution. Again, if we then move on to the next slide, I have included within the deck so that you'll have these available, just to touch on very quickly, some sources of further information. So at a European level, again, if we move to the next slide, we are using the European Commission Joint Research Centre, JRC, have been a very supportive partner for us. We're using their website as part of our communications hub for Eurocodes evolution. So it's a great place to go. If you just Google JRC and Eurocodes, you'll land on their website. It's a very useful resource. And if you just spin through the next few slides very quickly, we include links to a number of presentations. Again, the next slide, there's a video series that talks to the changes, non-technical content on the changes. Those are all available from the website. And also there's further details from a UK perspective. Again, if you jump to the next slide, that on the iStructD website, freely available, are a number of papers authored by a number of the speakers today, just setting out the background, but also the UK implementation plans. So again, those are also available to complement what we're talking about today. But with that, let me stop. I think I've just run a couple of minutes over, so apologies for that. But I hope that's been a useful introduction, and my pleasure to hand over to David.
Right, thank you very much, Steve. As Steve mentioned, I'm the chair of the UK Mirror Group, largely but not exclusively concerned with reviewing rather than writing, because the writing goes on in Europe, the reviewing, acceptance and customizing goes on in the individual countries. I'm very pleased to say that Steve is now the vice chair of that committee, and as you know, there is nothing like being able to put your heads together to deal with some seemingly intractable problem that actually turns out to be relatively straightforward in the discussion. If we can move on to the next slide, please. I have only 4 slides, and they're really just headlines to help me remember what I want to say and to help you understand the key aspects of this presentation. B525 has oversight of all UK involvement with the structural Eurocodes. That means now reviewing, commenting upon, and voting upon the various parts as they appear, and also taking a considerable interest in what is happening internally within the UK in order that the reception that the Eurocodes get, Generation 2, will be rather better than the one for Generation 1. My background is that I've been involved with the structural Eurocodes virtually the whole of my professional life, 50 years, and going back to the time when they were in their infancy. But even from that time, I think something like 5 out of 8 of the chairs of the relatively small number of subcommittees then came from the UK. And that practice has continued. The UK has been a very substantial contributor to and critic of, where necessary, the structural Eurocodes programme. So B525 oversees a large network of subcommittees, panels, individual experts, special working groups that deal with the detail of all the documents that Steve put up on the screen in the sense of the individual subject area committees, and below that, even more detailed material. We like to think that we've got a very large representation from individual experts and key organisations. So some parts of the coverage of the Eurocodes have professional or trade organisations dealing with them, particularly, for example, in geotechnics. Others are more individualistic because structural glass is a really rather close and small community. So we've sought out to get the most capable people involved in this important activity. At the bottom it says responsible for endorsing UK votes. B525 actually is the body that casts the vote or tells BSI how to vote, but it does that on the basis of recommendations from below. This is not an authoritarian regime. It is one very much of participation and relying wherever possible on the best advice from the most capable people. Next slide, please. So B525 has, as I've said, a very large collective membership. The actual committee probably runs to some 35 people, but beneath that there are scores of individuals involved. From the earliest days, the UK has been seen as one of the leading countries within Europe, and therefore its voice has been one that has been listened to, perhaps rather more than some of the countries with less history and less involvement in code development. For example, Steve mentioned robustness and progressive collapse. When the work started, the UK and to some extent Sweden were the only countries that had anything like any codified advice dealing with progressive collapse. Why? Because we had Ronan Point. And as you know, there have been various other incidents worldwide that have increased the focus on things like that. Similarly, not just structural glass, but membrane structures, polymers type structures are all new developments from Generation 1. But the vast majority of Generation 2 is straightforward evolution. It is not change for change's sake. It is change where something better can be done. This might be representing material that was already there, but perhaps because ease of use did not focus on the mandate for generation 1, was not given as much attention as it might have been, or including topics that were, at the time generation 1 was prepared, considered to be not sufficiently important or sufficiently mature to be dealt with by a structural Eurocode. Next slide, please. Next slide. Steve mentioned voting. It's an important part because it is an opportunity to make a statement about the national view on a document that is put forward for potential implementation. The process has always been to involve the key subcommittees and individuals and panels where appropriate, and for that decision to originate there and to come up to B525 to be transmitted. 3 possibilities: yes, abstain, or no. You've heard from Steve that no has featured very infrequently. Abstain is sometimes used where there is concern about a part of the document, but basically it is supported, but something needs to be done to actually make it appear a bit easier to use or to deal with something in particular. The key guiding principle here is that within Europe, we are one voice at the table. I'd like to think that we're a fairly significant voice at the table because of our track record. But we can't simply argue that we want our own way because that's the way we have done it traditionally. However, we do argue strongly where something appears to be unreasonable in the context of what has traditionally been perfectly acceptable in the UK. And just occasionally, there's a bit of a standoff where a couple of countries want to have something that has come perhaps fairly recently and not been subject to enormous scrutiny. And in the UK, we think maturity is important. You can't write design rules on the basis of something that one of your assistants did last night. But as you can see, the UK record reflects overwhelming support for the Eurocodes. I mean, I've personally been involved in only a very small number of what might be called politely differences of opinion, but what might be perhaps more accurately described as individuals being somewhat stubborn, thinking that their views outweigh those of the collective community. National annexes are a device for ensuring that Eurocodes, which were designed to be applicable across Europe, are appropriate for each of the individual countries. And they cover things like, for example, snow loading is clearly going to be a different topic with a different degree of importance in Scandinavia from what it is in Mediterranean countries. And I actually saw a particular example of this only the other day. You may have read in the press that northwest England suffered severe earthquakes and there were problems. If you read more carefully, you will see that damage was minimal because the UK is not generally regarded as a seismically active country. Generation 1 recognised that, and it was not necessary to consider seismic action in any part of the UK. Generation 2 actually changed that and redefined the lowest category, meaning that some areas, notably northwest England and parts of North Wales, would theoretically be in the you need specific consideration area. But thanks to a degree of persuasion and rationality and common sense, that has actually been modified so that the original Generation 1 definition, that only for areas where the client insists on consideration of seismic action, typically nuclear power stations and defence establishments, is it necessary to include any consideration, specific consideration of seismic events? So next slide, please. When Generation 1 was published, it was referred to by the then president of the Institution of Structural Engineers as the most significant influence on the design climate in the UK, more so than change to metrication or other things of that sort. Generation 2 should not be as significant a change because a lot of Generation 2 is evolution from Generation 1. More particularly, Generation 1 gained wider acceptance a year or two after it was introduced because the supporting information that designers use, computer software, worked examples, design guides, things of that sort, started to appear. For Generation 2, we have made, or CEN has made available the frozen technical draft of each of the Eurocodes to those bodies with a genuine interest in using it to prepare supporting information. So that work from organisations like Institution of Structural Engineers, Steel Construction Institute, geotechnical organisations and so on, is already well underway. And so when Generation 2 is published, and more particularly when Generation 1 is withdrawn, there should be a much more supportive environment for utilisation than was the case with Generation 1. I said at the end, the UK has invested much resource in ensuring that both the code documents themselves and the related design infrastructure will be seen as supportive by the users. It should be seen as beneficial, it should be seen as an improvement, it should be seen as an advance, and it should not be welcomed by the sort of comments we heard previously 10, 15 years ago. I hope I'm retired by the time that we have to use those. With that rather sad comment, I'd like to pass on to Mungo and then to Chris to deal with case study.
Great, many thanks, David. So if we move on, my role is the chair of the B5251 committee, which is the UK committee that looks after actions and basis of design. And as Cara said it in her introduction, as of January, I will also become the chair at European level of SC1, which looks after actions. So moving on, actions in Eurocode have this nifty iconic representation. And if you click on the right-hand side, what is represented in the Eurocode is the actual actions that apply to our structures. And these may include the imposed loads that arise from occupancy of buildings, so the people and the materials within our buildings. It may include the environmental actions, the temperatures, the wind, the snow, etc., that apply loads onto our buildings that we need to design against. And it also includes the human-induced actions, such as our traffic actions that load bridges. Moving on, in the Eurocodes, all of these actions are reflected in a set of 12 parts, and the content represented on that page is well over 1,000 pages. So within the presentation today, I'm just going to draw attention to some of the more significant changes which apply commonly across various regular forms of structures. Within those actions parts, compared with first generation, there are some entirely new parts. So we have a new part on waves and currents on coastal structures, also a new part on atmospheric icing. But the other parts that are listed there are an evolution from what has been already available in first generation Eurocodes. One of the big concerns facing structural designers in this day and age is the effects of the changing climate, both in terms of how we can try to decarbonize our construction works and have sustainable design solutions, and also how we can respond to those what seem to be now inevitable changes in climate. And you'll see in this list that there are various climatic actions, so the snow, the wind, the temperatures, the icing. And when we're considering long design life structures, so buildings with 50-year design life, bridges with 100+ years of design life, we do need to start thinking about how those structures will remain safe over the course of their design life if the climate is changing. So moving on, one of the key achievements in second generation Eurocodes has been to come up with and implement a consistent framework for how the effects of climate change are dealt with. And Steve and David have alluded to the voting process. So to get agreement across 34 countries about a consistent framework of how climate change will be dealt with across all of those different actions parts is a really major achievement. On this page, I've highlighted how some of these provisions will look for wind. There are very similar provisions also for the other atmospheric actions for the temperature, the snow, the atmospheric icing. And in general, what these include are the following. So point 1 is we have a mandatory requirement using the shall verb form that the effects of climate change shall be taken into account. So again, that's a major achievement that climate change is affecting us. It needs to be taken into account in structural design. How is that done? Point 2, this note 1, gives a default method by which that can be done, which is a scaling factor approach. So we take our basic velocities, our basic temperatures, and we will scale them up either with a multiplication or an addition, depending on the exact climatic variable. So there's a default approach that is a nationally determined parameter. So the UK can then make a choice about whether that approach or an alternative approach is used. Point 3 recognises that there is geographical variation here. The climate change may affect different countries in Europe in different ways based on that future climate modelling and the current climate. So like David talked about the seismic effects, this is one of those areas where the exact way in which climate change will be factored is left to an individual country through a nationally determined parameter. So the values for those scaling factors will be set in the national annex. And then lastly, point 4 acknowledges that some clients or some structures may have special requirements, which are either set by a relevant authority or agreed for the specific project by the relevant parties. So in addition to the basic provisions, which will be given in the national annex, the defaults, there is also that opening to do something different or something additional on a project if that is the sensible thing to do and is agreed for that particular project. If we just then move on, there's currently work in progress within the BSI committees to look at what should those choices be for the scaling factors. And just to illustrate that, a work in progress at the moment is to look at some of the climate projections which are produced and made available by the UK Met Office. On the screen, we have an analysis based on the global warming level 4, so a 4-degree rise in temperature, and what that might mean for extreme values of snow distribution in future years. There are a variety of different scenarios produced through the Met Office projections. So the current exercise is looking at from those different scenarios, from the different global warming levels, from the different model runs, what should a sensible, easy to use, but safe, but not too conservative factor be that applies into our structural design? As I say, work in progress, but that will be emerging in the draft national annexes, which will be becoming available for comment next year. So moving on then, I'll just next look at some imposed loads. So this is covered by EN 1991-11. One of the improvements in ease of use here is to collect together all of the different categories of imposed load, bring them together into a single table, which gives the different categories and the different loads. What's shown on the screen is the basic choices from the Eurocode, but as highlighted in that red box at the top, this is a nationally determined parameter. So for regular use for structures in the UK, you will need to look at the national annex to get the specific uses. Moving on, one of the sustainability considerations that's been subject to debate is whether we are over-designing our floor loadings. And so it's been very pleasing to see a recent study which is drawing together a combination of academics from various universities together with industry practitioners, driven by that question of what should the loading on our buildings be. So they've done some statistical modelling. Interestingly, it turns out that it is the evacuation scenarios that govern things like the fire alarm, weather test, or reality. And when you look at the extreme values, it does produce a value very similar to what is currently in the UK National Annex. So that 2.5 kilonewtons for category B1 has been validated by the recent work. So it's likely that those office floor loadings will remain the same as they have been. However, what has been noted is that there is a lot of design practice that chooses to use more onerous loading than is justified by the statistical modelling and the basis. So some interesting work there to look at. That work may also justify a reduction in partition loading and the uplift that has been traditionally applied for those. Moving on, another aspect of imposed load is car park loading. And you may have seen in the news on the BBC just this week articles about car spreading, which is that vehicles are getting bigger and heavier, and particularly electric vehicles with the extra loading on batteries. So it is likely that the UK National Annex will choose to increase the loads for car parks compared with what has been the past National Annex provisions, although interestingly, that increased loading is already present in industry guidance, such as the iStruct car park design guidance, which has recently been issued. So the standards will be catching up with that latest thinking on industry practice. Okay, so on the next slide, we'll move then onto some different types of actions. So looking next at snow, we have some changes in terminology. Previously, we talked about drifted, undrifted, a bit of a change there to talk about balanced and unbalanced, reflecting that the unbalanced comes not just from wind causing snow to redistribute, but from other considerations of snow redistributing. On the next slide, wind, one of the main changes with wind is bringing together all the different types of structure into a unified approach, particularly the provisions for towers and masts, also the provisions for bridges, now take a consistent set of formulae with those for buildings, and we have a set of coefficients for the pressure coefficients, the force coefficient in a series of annexes for the different forms of structure. And then lastly, for these types of actions, on the next slide, we have thermal. One of the changes here is to clarify how uncertainty in initial temperature is characterized, particularly for bridges. And we have here at the top a diagram showing that the range of expansion temperatures and the range of contraction temperatures, how those both take into account that initial overlapping range of uncertainty of the initial temperature when fixity is made. So that's a tidying up of something that has been done but hasn't been clearly identified. Okay, so finally then on my last slide, there is further guidance available. On the left-hand side, this is already available. I've given the hyperlink down there at the bottom. There are a series of design examples that have been produced across all the different Eurocode parts. That's freely available from the JRC website that Steve has already mentioned. In particular, I authored a set of worked examples on a steel frame buildings, considering all the various different types of actions. Just take care though, because these use default parameters from Eurocodes rather than the nationally determined parameters. There's also work in hand to update various industry guidance, such as all of the iStruct manual to Eurocodes. So with that, I'll then hand over to Chris Hendy, who will give some detail of some of the changes that are happening for bridges. So over to you, Chris.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Mungo. So as Mungo says, I'm going to talk about some of the improvements made in second generation Eurocodes for bridges. So if we move on, please. I just wanted to sort of start really by just emphasising something that David said earlier on, which was the intention was not to make wholesale technical changes for the sake of it, but just for some fairly limited reasons. And those were technical changes where the current rules in Gen 1 are not sufficiently safe, or perhaps are actually too safe. To make changes where if there are a number of possible alternative rules that could be used to do the same thing, if they don't give consistent results, then the intention was to tidy those up to make them more consistent. And also some new rules may be added in certain situations to cover the design with perhaps more recently available materials or different construction types or modelling techniques. And when you look at those as a whole, the impact has really been a relatively moderate, I would say, amount of change for steel bridge design, but some pretty significant change from concrete design. So what I'm going to do is just look at some typical examples under those sort of bullets of some of the changes. So if we move on and start with Eurocode 2, I think that the first thing you'll notice is that the concrete bridge part has actually been amalgamated in with the general concrete part and also the water retaining structures part. And the reason for that was actually most or many of the rules that were added in for bridges specifically were actually equally applicable to other concrete structures. So it made sense to bring them together. There's been a general trend to allow for design with stronger materials, stronger reinforcement, stronger pre-stress, and the scope overall of the document has increased, not just because of the merging of documents, but also because there are a lot more topics that are covered, and that's led to a fairly significant overall increase in the document length. Some of the specific things that have changed I'll come on to in a minute, but there are plenty of examples where alternative methods have been tidied up to give more consistent results. So shear, strut and tie, membrane rules, they've all been adjusted so that they give similar results. And some methods have been quite significantly changed just to give better compatibility with test results, such as punching shear. So if we move on, I think that the next slide, which shows a whole load of annexes, really kind of show how much additional scope we've got. So on the left-hand side, those annexes mostly currently exist in the Generation 1 suite, with the exception of Annex D there, I think, the early age thermal cracking. But many of the annexes on the right-hand side are all new increased scope. I won't read them all out, but they include things like assessment of existing structures, strengthening with CFRP, use of fibre-reinforced concretes, use of recycled aggregate concretes, for example. So I think you can see that the scope has increased quite considerably. Just some specific examples. If you move on, the specification or the way we calculate concrete strength has changed a little bit from the first generation Eurocode. So as with steel, the range of concrete strengths that you can use in the calculations has gone up. You can use higher concrete strengths. The specification of concrete strength, the cylinder strength, the default is still to do that at 28 days. But you're now able to specify the strength up to 91 days if that gives you some advantage. I'll talk about that briefly in a second. And the rule's been simplified as well. So when you calculate bending resistance, for example, no matter what the strength of the concrete, we now have one single limiting strain of 3.5 millistrain. And the brittleness effect that used to be dealt with in the first generation Eurocode by reducing that strain is dealt with a different way, which is actually shown on the next slide. So when we calculate our actual design strengths now, instead of having one factor alpha CC, which multiplies FCK, that's been replaced with two separate factors to actually give better correlation again with physical tests. And we've got two terms. Eta CC actually deals with that brittleness effect of increasing concrete strength, which means once you get beyond the cylinder strength of 40 MPa, your actual in situ strength is reduced slightly. And there's another term, KTC, which deals with the simultaneous effect of loss of strength with sustained loading, but also the increase in strength over time as the hardening reaction continues. If we move on to the next slide, there's been some significant changes made sort of generally for design of shear, in particular to design of shear where we don't have any shear reinforcement. And again, I won't talk through all of this, but one of the key challenges has been made to try to get the resistances in shear to work both for very shallow beams and very, very deep beams. There were some real challenges in the first generation Eurocode with actually accurately calculating the strength of deep beams like the one you can see in the image there. Typically, the strengths were coming out too unconservative. So some of the key changes that have been made: a modification to the partial factor that's used for shear. The aggregate size is now explicitly included in the resistance. That's important because of aggregate interlock and to get better, again, correlation with test results. But the really key thing in terms of the scale factor is an improvement in the depth factor. So the formula is now much more sensitive to increases in depth than the first generation formula is. Again, if we move on, to get compatibility with the shear rules, and also again to correct an area where the current rules are not always safe. The the strut and tie rules have now introduced a variable limit for the allowable stress in a strut. So in the first generation Eurocode, the limit is quite binary. It's either a limit for cracked or uncracked behaviour. In the second generation Eurocode, we now have a variable limit that is a function both of the angle of the strut between with the tie and also the strain in the tie. And just to kind of illustrate why that's necessary, if we just move on to the next slide, there was a deep beam test done in Toronto back in 2015 that was looking specifically at the effect of deep beams that I mentioned around shear, but also flat strut angles used in strut and tie models. So a deep beam test, I think 4 meters deep, was done. It had 2 shear spans, one with no reinforcement in and one with reinforcement in. And if we just move on to the next slide, if you try to use the first generation Eurocode to predict the failure load with the sort of binary choice of a cracked or uncracked strut, and we construct a strut and tie model, and we try to sort of work backwards to what the failure load would be, you would get a prediction of 1,692 kilonewtons, but unfortunately the failure load was only 685 kilonewtons, so it's out by a factor of 2.5. If you move on to the next slide, if you repeat that calculation now with the new method in the second generation Eurocode, the procedure does become iterative because you need the strain in the reinforcement, but you'll actually see that the ultimate answer comes out at 680 kilonewtons, which is almost a perfect match, which obviously is a fluke, but you can see just how much closer it gets to the actual answer. If we move on, just a few examples from Eurocode 3. Again, as with concrete, the steel grades that you can use are now elevated across all of Eurocode 3. There are some improvements on the rules to brittle fracture to distinguish between structures with fatigue and without fatigue. And some adjustments have also been made to the section classification limits in the general part 311, because in the first generation Eurocodes, there is a discrepancy at the class 3-4 boundary between what 1993-11 tells you is a class 4 structure and what 1993 part 1.5 tells you is the limit for a class 4 structure. So to tidy that up and make them consistent, the limits have been slightly adjusted within Eurocode 3. If we move on, there's been some additional material included that's very relevant for bridges. So in the first generation Eurocode, there's an interaction between bending and shear. There's an interaction between local patch loading on an unstiffened web and bending moment, but there's no interaction between the 3 of those things, in particularly between patch load and shear. And that was actually intentional in the first generation Eurocodes because it was considered that if you had a patch load, it would produce shear itself, and therefore you would be double counting. But that's only true if the patch load is the only load that's applied to the structure, or if it's applied, if it's not applied symmetrically, both or resisted by shear symmetrically, sort of both sides of the patch load. And that's the case in launching of bridges. We always have the need to consider all 3 of these forces together. So a completely new interaction equation has been added, and that now gives us a safe design in situations, particularly like bridge launching. If we move to the next slide, again, we have some more examples of where rules have just been improved. This is an example where the current first generation rules for designing things with flexible restraints like U-frame bridges like this were giving much higher forces in the connection design and the restraints than was previous British practice. Without going into any detail because we don't have time, the reason for that was really the bow imperfection in the flange that was used in the first generation Eurocode, which essentially is incorrect. That's now been modified, and now the forces are all much reduced in design and come back to much more like we had in previous British practice. Just move to the penultimate slide. Again, there's some examples of completely new material. So if we design sort of steel bridges that are curved in plan, these days they are mostly truly curved in plan, continuously curved. But the first generation Eurocodes don't give us any rules for designing in bending or in shear, where the actual web panels, for example, are curved in plan. So a new annex, it's a normative annex, that means you have to use it, has been added in, and that treats the effect in quite a simple way by modifying the rules for straight girders by adding a curvature factor for both bending and shear, and that allows us to have a continuity from curved to straight girders in a fairly simple way. So just to finish, I think, in summary, really, that all these updates that are trying to achieve the things I mentioned on my first slide really need to be balanced against not making too many changes that then require a lot of rework of design guides and software, re-education of designers, and also situations where it might appear that something that was designed before, if you check it to the second generation Eurocode, is no longer adequate. And I think, by and large, I think the various sort of technical committees have done a reasonably good job of achieving that. So thank you, and I'll pass on to Deirdre, please.
Thank you, Chris. Just thank you to yourself, and thank you to the previous speakers. I think it definitely highlights the basically impressive behind the scenes work that's going on by all the experts to ensure that the Eurocodes program runs smoothly. So thank you to you. Just as an introduction, I'm the lead standards development manager for the Eurocodes, and I support the experts and stakeholders that input into the Eurocodes work program. I'm just going to switch it a little bit and talk about sort of the activities we're doing at the UK level in terms of the national annex development, timelines, and just overall progress. So if we can just go to the next slide. This just gives you a snapshot of the committee structure. David talked earlier about B525 being the overall arching committee that oversees the input into the work of the national work into the Eurocodes program. And these are just some of the subcommittees that are involved. Underneath these, there's also panels, several panels involved. So I think you'd probably appreciate that it's quite an extensive amount of experts that get involved in lots and lots of topics across the board. And if we just move on to the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of what's been going on in terms of where we are nationally with respect to input to the Eurocode. So more recently, as we've said, one of the key activities is the committees have been contributing to that development of the second generation suite of standards. And what's happened recently is we've been inputting into the formal vote process. And just to give you an indication of how extensive the work program is, and I've got the numbers right, but the second generation suite consists of at least 65 parts in total. There's also accompanying documents like SEN technical specifications and technical reports. So it is quite a huge work program, and the UK committee has been key in inputting into the several parts that have been issued over the past couple of years. And by the time we get to Q1 of 2026, we're expecting that we'd have published at least 59 Eurocodes, with about 6 remaining in development, but those will be published by September 27. So in terms of the UK, what we've been doing with the second generation Eurocodes is publishing them within the UK as soon as they're available. This just allows for that transition from the first generation to the second. We also heard earlier from Steve and David about the Eurocodes allowing for national standards bodies to produce national annexes, and that gives us an opportunity to give those certain country-specific conditions and include national choices and around the application of informative annexes. So as an NSB, what we've done, if we go to the next slide, sorry, is we have prepared a schedule nationally of all the national annexes. So each Eurocode part will have a national annex, corresponding national annex. We don't always have a national annex, but those are very few if they decide to go with the default values. But this screenshot on the screen just shows a snapshot of some of the national annexes that are already in development. You can see the publication date of the actual Eurocode and the expected publication date of the actual national annex. So going back to that, what we've done is we've prepared this schedule based on the key milestones that have been set at SEND level for the implementation. So some of the key dates on that previous slide was the date of availability. So all the second generation Eurocodes are expected to be available across all national standards bodies by the 30th of March next year. And then what we've also got is the date of publication, and this is the 30th of September 2027. So this is the latest date by when all the parts of the Eurocode should be implemented nationally. And then finally, we heard about the date of withdrawal earlier from Steve, and that is the 30th of March 2028. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the task of the actual national annex drafting is given to the committees that we talked about earlier. And just in terms of where we are in terms of a schedule, to date, we've published at least 9 UK national annexes. But as I mentioned earlier, there's quite a number of Eurocode parts to which we're going to prepare national annexes for. So there's a remainder around maybe 56 are still under preparation. But the intention is that we're going to publish all of those at the latest by early 2027. Sorry, at the earliest date by 2026, and then the intention is to publish the full suite of national annexes by September 27. There's also 10 technical specifications that I talked about earlier, and these are the accompanying documents that are also produced as part of the Eurocode suite. And within those, we've also published 6 national annexes, and these have been incorporated into those technical specifications. So I will add that the dates that you saw on the previous snapshot, which was the schedule, and the publications are only estimates. Some are still to be confirmed, but it's mainly because there's lots of variables involved. It depends on how far the committee has got to developing a draft, any issues that they might come across that could then affect the national annex publication date. But I think from what we've heard and what we can see as part of the work program is quite extensive, and a lot has gone into it. So I'd probably just like to take this point to just say thank you to all our experts. Some might be on the call, and to our speakers already who are clearly involved in contributing to this work. So if you just want to go to the next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of the published annexes that I talked about. So we've got 15 in total. And then, sorry, if you move on to the next slide. As I said, some of the national annexes are still in development. And this is just a snapshot of those that have reached or are going to reach the draft for public comment stage. So part of the process for the national annexes is that they will go through a stage of development, which means that they'll be issued for public comment. And if you'd like to make any comments, there is a standards development portal, and there'll be a link at the end of the presentation. But just to reassure you that if you do make any comments, those comments are sent back to the committees who consider them as part of that finalized document. So there is that way in terms of contributing. If you're not part of the UK committee directly, we do try and gain wider feedback from industry by publishing the national annexes for public consultation. So I think that just takes us to the next slide, which is just the links on how to reach us, as well as some useful links on the next slide at the very end. And I will probably now take the opportunity to pass it over to Cara for the questions.
Thanks, Deirdre, and thanks to everyone for a massive amount of content and information there on Eurocodes. The first question, actually, we'll go to some Q&As. The first question, if I can have all of my speakers back, all of the speakers back on camera. Since we've just left you, Deirdre, we'll come straight to you to ask, how does one get involved? You've mentioned the standards development portal, which is great for commenting on specific standards, but if somebody wanted to join a committee or send on some general information or questions, how do they get involved?
So again, I mean, you can again, there'll be a link at the end of this presentation, and there's a link to get how you can get involved in committee membership, and there's a form to be filled in. If you're an existing member and you're interested in some of the Eurocodes that we've spoken about today, you can contact myself. My details will be at the end of the presentation as well, and we can guide you through the process of getting involved in the committee. Most of our members are experts from trade associations, or even in an individual capacity. So as long as you reach out to us, we can facilitate that process of getting you onto the committee.
Yeah, absolutely. Any involvement is absolutely massively welcome. So do please get in touch directly on that. Okay, next questions. We'll go to some specific technical ones that have come up. So I think this one is probably best answered by you, Mungo, if that's all right. So I'll read it out. Discussions within the flat roofing sector have indicated that UK National Annex to 1991-14 will be withdrawn, and things like external pressure coefficients will no longer be nationally determined parameters. Can you confirm that?
Steve mentioned David mentioned the different categories of yes, no, and abstain. Wind actions is one of the ones where there was considerable debate. We're currently working through that process at the moment, because we know that representations have already been made to the National Wind Committee around the default parameters that are given in the Eurocode and the change that those may represent compared with UK practice. And we're actively looking at the moment for a way to retain as much as we can of coefficients that we're comfortable with, that we know where they came from. So yeah, there is action in process, but the National Annex work is happening at the moment to try to resolve that. It's a known issue.
Wonderful. That's good to know that it's in hand already. I would expect nothing less, Mungo. Another specific one, if I can come to you, Chris, I think this is best answered by you, is are there any plans to make any changes to the barrier guarding loads in the UK National Annex for Gen 2?
I think that's best answered by me, Cara.
I mean, there's two types
Sorry,
of barriers.
Mungo again.
There's sort of big vehicle restraint barriers on bridges for high speed trunk roads, and then there's barriers in car park type areas which need to resist lower speed impacts. One of the changes in Eurocode is that on the face of it, what used to be present as an annex to 1991-11 giving barrier loads has been removed from the Eurocode. The intention of the UK Mirror Committee is to retain that content as a new annex, which we made available within the national annex. So we're intending to retain design methods for barrier loadings for low speed type impacts, such as in car parks or in building type environments.
Cara, it's probably worth just adding a little bit to that. So one of the changes that we haven't talked about between first and second generation is that the rules in the first generation were very strict about the provision of complementary information within national annexes, in that we weren't allowed to do it. And by and large, we stuck with that. But what we recognized in the second generation at a European level was that, in fact, in quite a lot of countries, they had included complementary information in their national annexes, and really there seemed to be no point in trying to rewind that position. So there was a broad acceptance that within our national annexes, as well as providing the values of NDPs, we can also include some complementary information where that kind of supports or addresses areas that it's helpful to provide some complementary additional material. And so we have some clear UK guidance on how we will do that within the UK national annexes, but what Mungo's talking about in terms of the provision of some additional information, complementary information to the Eurocodes, is something that we can now do within the Eurocodes in a manner that we weren't previously supposed to.
Fantastic. That's good to know. Thank you. Okay, next question. If I can stay with you, Steve, actually. You mentioned in your presentation about the inclusion of climate change in the second generation. And we've got some questions on what considerations does Eurocodes include in this topic, and are there any specific ones relating to specific Eurocodes relating to climate change?
Yeah, look, I think in talking about climate change, we obviously need to recognise the if you like, the two aspects here. The one is the adaptation to a changing climate, and the second is the efforts that we can take to mitigate the magnitude of climatic change. So if I kind of take those in turn, in terms of climate change adaptation, Mungo's talked to the most significant and important work there, which is that we need to design structures in the future to deal with changing climatic conditions, and Mungo spelled out how we have included that within the Eurocode coverage for environmental actions, and the really important step that was taken and unanimously agreed across all 34 CEN members, that we will make consideration of climatic change a requirement in the design of all structures in the future. So that's a very, very important, significant step. Detail to be resolved largely at a national level for the reasons that Mungo outlined. In terms of climate change mitigation, it's important to recognize that the model we have for standardization across Europe is that we look for our standards to serve, if you like, a single core function. And the function of the Eurocodes are at their core to enable us to ensure that design structures are safe, serviceable, robust, and durable. And so we don't, it's not appropriate for us to, within the Eurocodes, include general material around climate change mitigation. I mean, that is addressed actually within other standards within the CEN family of standards. That being said, however, there are a lot of things that we can do as engineers designing to the Eurocodes to reduce the carbon impacts of the work that we do. And what we sought to do in the second generation of the Eurocodes through the provisions that are included within the standards is give designers greater opportunity to be able to design in a manner which reduces the carbon impacts. So you won't see clauses that talk explicitly necessarily about carbon impacts, but there's a lot in there that's enabling, that should help equip designers with the ability to reduce the carbon intensity of our designs. So to give a few illustrations around that, one is around design efficiency and unlocking opportunity for greater use of numerical methods in design that can hopefully drive design efficiency. Another element is around materials and material selection. I think, Chris, you put up the list of annexes, and one of the annexes in 1992 deals with recycled aggregates, for example. So that's another strand around material choices. And probably the third, and potentially the most important, I think, is that one of the greatest contributions that we can make as civil, structural, geotechnical engineers in terms of carbon reduction is actually to extend the life of our existing assets. And in terms of extending the life of our existing assets, providing within the Eurocode suite some key content to enable the assessment and retrofitting of existing structures is a really, really important enabler there. And so again, part of the motivation for that work was because of our efforts to try and reduce the carbon intensity across our sector. But again, I would just emphasize that point that you won't see that within the standard as being associated necessarily with reduction of carbon intensity and climate change mitigation, but that was absolutely central to our thinking when we included it within the standard. Cara, before you move to the next question, I did want to add one further thing. Deirdre, you very generously thanked all the experts for the work that they have done. But actually, one of the things that we didn't mention is that BSI has provided the Secretariat at a European level for the work of TC250. And when I talked earlier about, I think the collective pride that we can feel across Europe for some of the achievements, the timeline, the focus, the programmatic approach, actually the work of BSI in supporting that and providing the Secretariat has been absolutely instrumental. And it would be remiss of me, since Deirdre, you were very kind in thanking the expert contribution, for me not to acknowledge the huge amount of work that Tracy Wilkins has done as the Secretary of TC250 and the broader contribution from BSI, because it has been absolutely central to what we've been able to do across the Eurocode programme.
Yeah, I second that. I loved your numbers earlier in one of your slides at 0.3% of a negative vote, and equates to 7 out of, was it 2,000, over 2,000 you said, Steve?
Over 2,000 opportunities for voting, and actually one of the things that we've also been doing at a European level is really looking to track some metrics and to understand whether we were achieving some of those ambitions. And whilst I didn't talk about it earlier, we've been looking very closely on a like-for-like basis between first generation and second generation standards around things like page count changes and numbers of NDPs, and the indications to date where we've been able to do those comparisons show that on a like-for-like basis we've reduced the number of NDPs by around 30%, and on a like-for-like basis reduced the page count by about 13%. Now, as Chris has explained and Mungo has talked to, and kind of build on what David said, there is new content within the Eurocode. So overall, of course, there are additional pages to cover that new content, and there are new NDPs that are associated with some of that new content. But on a like-for-like basis of the scope of the first generation and the coverage of that material within the second generation, we've actually achieved, two of our more direct ambitions, which was around reducing page count or making sure that there wasn't an expansion of page count, and also to reduce number of NDPs, and we've been successful on both those fronts.
Cara, sorry, and also before you just move on to the next question, could I just taking us back to Steve's comments around climate change, I just wanted to make one other point, which is sort of, I would say, probably tangentially relevant, but I think absolutely we've been working on trying to facilitate use of numerical methods. I think the team's been working quite hard to eliminate rules that are uneconomic. But I just wanted to point back to an iStruct report that, from about 5 years ago, that did a study into actually what sort of typical utilizations designers work to, which showed that typically most designers were reluctant to design more than to about 80%. Utilization, and on average more like 60%. So if we really do want to get the benefits out of these improvements as well as a sort of cultural shift, we do need to sort of work towards the limits in the codes. I think as we've improved the reliability of the rules, we should also be much more confident in working right to those limits. And a design that's 100% utilization is still a perfectly safe design. So I just wanted to make that point.
Chris, if I might come in with that, I mean, it's a very, very well made point, a very important point. And again, people won't see it transparently, I suppose. But one of the, part of why we've had such a strong focus on ease of use and clarity is that, I think, Chris, as you alluded to, I think part of the reason why conservatism sometimes occurs in design is because of the confidence of designers in their interpretation of the standards. And so, what we've sought to do is to improve that clarity and understandability, because hopefully that starts to change that issue that we have. And it's a very genuine issue that Chris talked about. It's absolutely, 100% right, and the iStruct work's very important on this front, as well as the work of a number of researchers in that field. There are a lot of structures that are designed with relatively low utilization factors, and that both has economic implications from a financial perspective, but it also has really profound implications from a carbon perspective as well.
I have 1,000 follow-up questions on that, so maybe I have to buy you a cup of tea sometime, David. But at the risk of us all being thrown out, I understand that GoTo likes to just end things. I think we'd best close it there from a Eurocodes perspective, and say that we will try and put together an FAQ document. So if you have questions that you are mulling over, please do send them in, and we'll add them and then try to circulate that as well. So I'll say thank you to all of the Eurocode speakers, and then hand back over to Ian to close the session.
Yes, thank you, Cara. I was so invested in the conversation and the questions there that I almost forgot that I'm still chairing this event and I needed to close it off. So thank you for mentioning my name to prompt me to come back on. Yeah, thank you so much to all the speakers. There were quite a few of you covering an enormous amount of information, and you did an amazing job in putting it across in a way that was really useful and went into the depth that I think all of the people on this meeting would like. So, as you say, there is some follow-up activity. We mentioned the feedback survey at the outset. Please do fill that in when you get that, and you'll get the recording link. If we just go to the next slide, there's one event coming in January that we would like to draw your attention to going forward. There'll be a number in January that might be of interest to you, but one in particular is our Fire Safety Conference on the 29th of January. This is an in-person event at the IET in Savoy Place, London. You can see from the QR code that's on the screen at the moment, if you scan that, then you will be able to go to the landing page and register. But also, I believe the link will find its way into the chat as well if it hasn't already. So that's probably it. My thanks again to the speakers. My thanks again to the colleagues from BSI that helps navigate us through such amazing topics today. My thanks to you for coming and joining, and also, if you are watching on demand and you've got this far into it, thank you so much for watching back on the recording too. Please do ask us any questions afterwards if you wish to reach out. And thanks to the BSI events and technical team in the background for all of your support. You did an amazing job too. So that's all from us. We thank you so much again, and Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. All the best, and we shall see you again soon. Thank you so much. Bye bye.